This is a functions question, so let's zoom in and get started. So part A, part 1 says state which value of x cannot be included in the domain of f. So we have a look at f and we see that f of x is 1 over x plus 2. Well, I know that I can't divide anything by 0, that would be not defined, so that must be not included. So if I'm dividing 1 by 0, that must mean that x plus 2 equals 0. So that's my answer. X plus 2 equals 0 is what can't happen, because you can't divide anything by 0, so x is negative 2, and that's my answer. For part B, they very helpfully bold this word values, so it's plural. So for part A we were just looking for one value, but for part A part 1, but for A part 2 we're looking for values, which values of x cannot be included in the domain of G. So I have a look at G, and you should know that you cannot take, in the domain of real numbers, you cannot take the square root of a negative number. So the values that could not be included are where x minus 1 is negative. So x minus 1 is less than 0, that's the same as saying x minus 1 is negative. Adding 1 to both sides gives x is less than 1, and those are the values. Any value of x less than 1 cannot be included. So moving on to part B, where we have to calculate fg of 10. I've written out the functions again just from the top because that's not on the screen anymore. And we should know that fg of 10 is the same as f of g of 10. So when you're working through these, you work from the inside out. So first I'm finding g of 10, and then I'm doing f of that. So g of 10 is the same as the square root of 10 minus 1, which is the square root of 9, which is 3. So I'm actually finding f of 3 now, and f of 3 is 1 over 3 plus 2, which is 1 over 5. So my final answer is 1 over 5. For part C, we have to find the inverse function of g. So we start off, there's a couple of different ways of doing this. One way would be to start off by saying our function g, let's call it y, and saying y equals the square root of x minus 1, because that's what our g is. G is the square root of x minus 1. And then we basically have to rearrange to make x the subject. So I square both sides, I get y squared equals x minus 1, add 1 to both sides, y squared plus 1 equals x. And then you kind of have to switch the x's and y's, so you end up with y equals x squared plus 1, and that is your inverse function. So g to the minus 1 of x, that's the inverse function of g, is x squared plus 1. Okay, and that's what I've written as an answer. There is another way you can look at this. Another way to look at this is to consider the function g, and to get g we start with an x, and this is how we build it up. First we do minus 1, and we get x minus 1, then we take the square root, and we get the square root of x minus 1. So the inverse function is like doing the reverse operations. So for the inverse function of g, I always start, my input is always x, so I start with an x, and then I do the reverse operations. So where in g I had done a square root, I have to square going backwards here. So I start with an x and I square it to get x squared, and then the reverse of, or the inverse of minus 1 is plus 1. So from my x squared I add 1 and I get x squared plus 1. It gives me the same answer. The inverse function of g is x squared plus 1.